market. With this lesson, we begin building the most important model in economics, the model of the market. A market is a place where buyers and sellers trade some good or service, and their interaction will determine the price at which that good trades and the quantity of the good that's actually traded. In order to build this model, we're going to break it into pieces. First, we're going to examine the motivations of buyers. What determines the quantity of a good or service that people want to purchase in a given period of time? This is called demand. Then we'll look at the motivation of sellers. What determines the quantity of a good or service that businesses are willing to sell in a given period of time? This is called supply. Then we'll put the buyers and the sellers together and look at how their interactions establish a stable price and quantity traded. This is called equilibrium. So, demand, supply, and equilibrium. Let's start with demand. Demand describes the behavior of households and answers the question, how much of a particular good or service do households purchase in a given period of time? Let's take some explicit example. Suppose we're talking about the good bread. And suppose we want to answer the question, how much bread does a typical household purchase in a week? Well, what we want to do in order to answer this question is make a list of all of the factors that influence the quantity of bread that a household would be willing and able to buy. And probably chief among the factors that influence people's quantity of bread purchased is the price of bread. We can also consider the price of other products like cheese or bologna that people enjoy along with bread. We can also consider the price of substitute goods like bagels that provide the same satisfaction in a different way. We can also consider the purchasing power or income of the household. Tastes and preferences probably play a role also, as well as expectations of what's going to happen to the price of bread in the future. If we want to see how any of these variables influences the quantity of bread that a household purchases in a week, we've got to examine it in some orderly fashion. That is, if we want to know how changes in the price of bread influence the quantity of bread demanded, we've got to isolate the effect of the price of bread by holding all of the other variables constant. This holding constant is accomplished by an assumption that economists call ceteris paribus, from the Latin phrase that means everything else held the same. So, if we want to know how a change in the price of bread influences the behavior of a household, we've got to say, ceteris paribus, all of the other factors that might influence the quantity demanded. If we hold these other things constant then, what do we expect will happen when the price of bread rises? Likely what will happen is the quantity of bread demanded will fall. This is what economists call the law of demand, that an increase in the price of a good typically leads to a reduction in the quantity of that good demanded. And if you think about it, it does kind of make sense. After all, if the price of bread goes up, then people's income now can buy less bread. So the reduction in their purchasing power is going to leave them able to purchase less. Also, when the price of bread goes up, the opportunity cost of bread, measured against other goods, has increased as well. This is what economists call the substitution effect. People buy less bread because they're willing to buy less. They'd rather buy other goods that provide the same satisfaction at lower opportunity cost. So the law of demand says that there is an inverse or opposite relationship between the price of bread and the quantity of bread demanded. What about another factor, like the price of a complementary good? A complementary good is a good that is enjoyed along with the good in question. So a complementary good for bread might be butter, or cheese, or bologna, or peanut butter, or anything else that you enjoy along with bread. See, you're buying bread not for its own sake, because bread is one element in creating something that you really want, like a peanut butter sandwich. And if the price of peanut butter goes up, or if you're after a grilled cheese sandwich and the price of cheese goes up, then overall the price of the good that you really desire, the sandwich, has risen. And by the law of demand, you're going to then want fewer of these sandwiches, or you'll be able to afford fewer of these sandwiches. And since you want fewer sandwiches, that means less bread. So, we have the rule that an increase in the price of a complementary good leads to a reduction in the quantity of this good demanded. A decrease in the price of that complementary good, on the other hand, will lead you to buy more bread, because now cheese sandwiches are a bargain, you're going to want more of them, and that means buying more bread as well as more cheese. Let's consider now the effect of the price of a substitute good, holding constant everything else. A change in the price of a substitute good, ceteris paribus, is going to lead to a change in the demand of our original good in the same direction. So, if the price of bagels goes up, all of a sudden bagels don't look like such a good way to get your carbohydrate satisfaction, and you switch to bread instead. On the other hand, if the price of the substitute good falls, if bagels are now less expensive, go buy bagels instead, and the quantity of bread demanded will be reduced. So, ceteris paribus, an increase in the price of a substitute good increases the quantity demanded of the original good, and a decrease in the price of the substitute good causes a decrease in the quantity of the original good demanded. What about income? And here things are a little bit more complicated, because an increase in your income can have either effect, really, on the amount of a good you purchase, depending on what kind of good it is. Most goods, what we call normal goods, see that when your income increases, you'll actually purchase a larger quantity. Your purchasing power is increased, you feel wealthier, and you buy more bread. On the other hand, there's a certain category of goods called inferior goods for which the opposite is true. When your income goes up, you actually buy less of these goods. Some goods like public transportation, potted meat products, things that people can't wait to have enough money so that they can buy something else instead. For example, beans. Poor people tend to spend more money on beans than people at higher income levels. And when your income level rises, you may typically buy less beans and more meat instead. In that case, beans are acting as an inferior good. An increase in your income leads to a reduction in the quantity of beans demanded. So the effect of income, ceteris paribus, depends on whether the good is a normal good or an inferior good. A normal good, an increase in income, leads to an increase in the quantity of the good demanded. An inferior good has exactly the opposite effect. An increase in income leads to a decrease in the quantity of the good demanded. What about tastes and preferences? And here the relationship is pretty straightforward. We don't really have a number to put on tastes and preferences, so we describe this qualitatively. We say that if people just suddenly decide they like bread better than other things, they'll buy more bread, ceteris paribus. On the other hand, if people decide that they don't like bread, or they're concerned about the effect of bread on their health, or something like that, then tastes and preferences shift away from bread, and people will buy less bread, ceteris paribus. Finally, there's the effect of the expectation of future prices. What are households going to do if they think the price of bread is going to be rising in the future? Well, ceteris paribus, the expectation of a higher future price for bread leads people to buy more bread now. Either they're going to stock up or they're going to enjoy bread before it moves out of their price range. On the other hand, if people expect that the price of bread is going to fall in the future, they're going to reduce the quantity of bread that they purchase today and hang back and wait for the lower price. So we have these factors then that influence people's purchasing behavior. And we can now collect these factors in a mathematical way and build what we call a demand function. The demand function describes the quantity of bread that the household is willing and able to purchase in a given period of time as a function of all of these variables that influence that decision. It'll look something like this. The quantity of bread demanded is the variable that we want to explain. So we're going to say that that is determined by, or equal to, a function of all of those variables that we just listed. I'm going to use here the letter D to represent the function, kind of like sometimes we say f of x is a function. This time it's going to be D, or demand, as a function of the variables that influence people's buying behavior. So here's the price of the good in question. And remember, ceteris paribus, a higher price means a smaller quantity demanded. A lower price means an increase in quantity demanded. The next variable that influences this decision is the price of complementary goods. And remember, the higher the price of complements, ceteris paribus, the lower the quantity demanded. And the lower the price of complements, the higher the quantity demanded. The next factor is the price of substitute goods. Remember, the price of substitute goods moves in the same direction as the quantity of the good demanded. So, a higher price for substitutes, ceteris paribus, leads households to buy more of the good in question. A lower price of substitutes leads households to buy less of the good. The next factor is income, and the effect of income depends on whether the good is a normal good or an inferior good. For a normal good, more income leads to more quantity demanded, ceteris paribus. For an inferior good, more income leads to a lower quantity demanded, ceteris paribus. The other variables that influence people's behavior are tastes and preferences and the expectation of what the price is going to be in the future. At this point, I can put a parenthesis on the other side and indicate that I've collected all of the variables that I'm going to be concerned about. There may be other things that influence people's behavior, but we can probably lump those things under taste and preferences, the little idiosyncratic things that may affect one household but not affect another. So here we've got a range of variables, a collection of factors that influence people's willingness and ability to purchase bread. So what do we do next? Well, what we're going to do next is we're going to focus our attention on the variable that's most important for our building the model of the market. Remember, the market is going to explain the quantity of the good traded and the price at which those trades occur. So we want to focus our attention now on how the price of the good itself influences the quantity of the good that people are willing and able to buy. And to focus our attention on the effect of the price, we're going to hold constant, and that's what I mean when I draw this horizontal bar above the name of a variable. We're going to hold constant everything else that influences people's behavior. The price of complements, the price of substitutes, income, tastes, and expectations. Ceteris paribus, all of these variables, we're now going to focus our attention on the way in which changes in the price of bread influence the quantity of bread demanded. And this is how we begin to construct what economists call the demand curve. In the last lesson, we introduced the concept of the demand function. The demand function shows the relationship between the quantity of bread that a household is willing and able to purchase in a week and all of the factors that influence household behavior. We showed that the quantity of bread demanded depends on the price of bread, the price of substitute goods, the price of complement goods, the price of inputs, household income, and the expectations of future prices. In this lesson, we want to focus our attention on a particular variable, and that is the price of bread itself, and how the price of bread influences the quantity of bread demanded. In order to focus on the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity of bread demanded, we'll want to hold constant all of the other variables that influence household behavior. There's an assumption that means holding all things constant. Do you remember the name of that assumption? The assumption is called ceteris paribus, and in this lesson we'll be deriving a demand curve. The demand curve shows the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity of bread demanded. Ceteris paribus, or holding constant, all other factors that influence consumer behavior. Let's begin then by looking at a demand schedule. A demand schedule shows a relationship between price and quantity demanded, holding constant all of the other variables that influence household behavior. Let's start with a list of bread prices. Here are a list of bread prices: $5 per loaf, $4 per loaf, $3 per loaf, and so forth, on down to 50 cents per loaf. Now, for each one of these prices, holding constant everything else, we'll find that household behavior changes, that a different quantity of bread is purchased with each different price for bread. Let's look now at a table that shows the quantities associated with each of these prices. Now, remember, behind this table of numbers, there is the assumption that we are holding constant bagels at a particular price. We're holding constant cheese at a particular price. We're holding the price of milk and eggs constant. We're holding consumer income constant. We're holding expectations constant. The only things we are allowing to vary are the price of bread and the quantity of bread that the household will buy. So when the price of bread is $5 per loaf, this particular household will buy 1 loaf of bread per week. If the price falls to $4 per loaf, holding constant everything else, the household will now increase the quantity demanded to 2 loaves of bread per week. As the price falls to $3, this household will increase its quantity further, and so forth, so that if the price of bread falls all the way down to 50 cents per loaf, this household will buy 9 loaves of bread per week. This is called a demand schedule, a relationship between the price of bread and the quantity of bread that the household is willing and able to buy, holding constant all other factors that influence household behavior. In order to turn this table of numbers into a powerful logical tool, we're going to introduce a graph with price and quantity and turn these numbers into a demand curve. The demand curve we'll later use to describe how price and quantity are set in a market where buyers and sellers are interacting. So let's move these numbers over to the board where we'll have access to them, and let's put up a graph where we can represent these numbers graphically. First thing you want to do in economics, anytime that you are drawing a graph, is carefully label the axes. In this case, we're going to put the price of bread on the vertical axis, and we're going to measure the price of bread in dollars. So here's $6 per loaf, $5 per loaf, $4 per loaf, and so forth. As the numbers get larger, the price of bread per loaf is increasing. So the price of bread rises as we go further and further up the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, we'll represent the quantity of bread that households are willing and able to buy. We'll represent the quantity of bread demanded, measured in loaves purchased per week. So here's the price of bread in dollars per loaf. Here's the quantity of bread purchased per week. Now let's take the numbers over on the board from our table and represent them in the diagram as points on a curve. So we'll start with the highest price of $5 per loaf and the quantity of bread 1 loaf demanded per week. So we go 1 loaf on the horizontal axis up to the price of $5 per loaf, and we can put a dot here representing that when the price of bread is $5 per loaf, this particular household will buy 1 loaf per week. If the price falls to $4 per loaf, then according to the numbers in our table, the household will purchase 2 loaves per week. So we put a dot here at $4 per loaf and 2 loaves purchased per week. Here we now have 3 loaves purchased, and that happens if the price is as low as $3 per loaf. So here's another point that represents a combination of price and quantity that our household that represents household behavior. Then we get 4 loaves purchased when the price drops as low as $2.50 per loaf. So here's 4 at $2.50. And we just keep going, putting the points in. We get 5 loaves when the price is $2.10 per loaf. So that's that point. We get 6 loaves if the price is $1.80 per loaf. So put that point in right here. And we get 7 loaves if the price is $1.50 per loaf. So that's going to be this point here. And we get 8 loaves if the price is $1 per loaf. So let's see if I can find that point. $1 and 8 loaves. And 9 loaves if the price is 50 cents per loaf. So that's this point here. What I did was take each combination of price and quantity from my table and represent it as a red dot in this diagram. Red is going to be my official color for demand, so I've represented all of these combinations with red dots. Here's a question. Are these the only imaginable quantities of bread? Are these the only imaginable prices? Absolutely not. We can imagine, first of all, that the price could vary continuously from 0, that is free bread, all the way up to $10 per loaf, and anything in between. any price imaginable. The price could be 101, it could be 105, it could be 174. All of the prices on the vertical axis are possible. Also, all the quantities are possible, not just discrete quantities like 1 loaf of bread per week or 5 loaves of bread per week, but we could also imagine 2.5 loaves of bread per week. What would that mean? That would mean that you buy 5 loaves of bread every 2 weeks, so that on average each week you're buying 2½ loaves. So we can imagine that bread could be divided up into very, very small fractions, and the price also varies continuously. If that's the case, we can connect the dots and represent the consumer's behavior with a smooth curve that shows a continuous relationship between price and quantity. So let me connect those dots. And this gives us what we call in economics a demand curve. And I'm going to label this with a D to make clear that I know that it's a demand curve. Here's the definition of the demand curve. The demand curve shows the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity that the consumer is willing and able to purchase in a given period of time, holding constant all other factors that influence consumer behavior, such as the price of substitutes, the price of complements, income, expectations, and so forth. The first thing you want to notice about the demand curve is the demand curve is downward sloping. Now, what does that tell us? What does it tell us that economists almost always draw the demand curve downward sloping? Well, the downward sloping demand curve is a way of representing that as the price of the good rises, the quantity demanded falls. Economists call this relationship the law of demand. The law of demand states that when the price of a product increases, consumers are willing and able to purchase less of it. Now, it's not true necessarily that this is always the case. Some goods, people will actually buy more of them as they get more expensive. But in general, we observe that when the price of goods and services increase, people are willing and able, and in fact do, buy less of them. Does this make sense? Well, in fact, it does make sense for 2 reasons. The first reason is what we call the substitution effect. When the price of a good rises, consumers, seeking to get the most satisfaction from their limited income, will stop buying this more expensive good and switch to other substitutes instead. For example, when bread gets more expensive, consumers try to get their carbohydrate satisfaction by buying bagels or potatoes instead. The higher price for bread leads consumers to substitute away from bread and seek less expensive substitutes. The second reason behind the law of demand is what we call the income effect. When the price of bread rises, then a consumer is able to purchase less. That is, if bread goes from $1 per loaf to $3 per loaf to $6 per loaf, meanwhile, I'm living on a limited income that's not changing, a constant income. Now my purchasing power, the purchasing power of my income measured in bread, is shrinking. If I have $10 to spend on groceries each week and the price of bread is $1 per loaf, I can afford 10 loaves of bread. But if the price goes up to $5 per loaf, I can only afford to purchase 2 loaves of bread. This is the income effect. I buy less bread because my purchasing power is shrinking, measured in terms of bread. So the substitution effect and the income effect are 2 rationales behind the law of demand. When the price of a good rises, we expect people to purchase less of it because they are willing to purchase less. They're going to look for less expensive substitutes, and they are able to purchase less because the purchasing power of their income is shrinking. In the next lesson, I'm going to look at what happens to the demand curve when we allow those other factors, those factors that we held constant, to change. Suppose now we allowed the price of bagels to change, or consumer income to change. How would that influence the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity that this particular household demands in a week? In the previous lesson, we looked at the demand curve, the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity of bread that a household is willing and able to purchase in a week. When you draw a demand curve, you hold constant all of the other factors that influence household behavior. Factors like the price of substitutes, the price of complements, household income, expectations, and so forth. You might ask yourself, how do we represent a change in one of those other factors? After all, it's very easy to show how the household responds to a change in the price of bread. You just move up or down the demand curve. But what if the price of bagels changes? Or what if consumer income changes? In that case, it turns out that we get an entirely new relationship between the price of bread and its quantity demanded. And once we have a new relationship, a new demand schedule, we have to draw a new demand curve. In this lesson, we will show how the change in one of the factors that we usually hold constant will cause us to have to shift the demand curve, that is, to redraw it in a new position. Let's go back to the original demand schedule we used in our last story. Here's a particular household, and this household has behavior that's represented by these numbers. At a price of $5 per loaf, they demand 1 loaf of bread per week. $4 a loaf means 2 loaves of bread per week for them, and so forth. These numbers representing the quantity of bread that they are willing and able to purchase at these different prices for bread. But suppose now we make a change in one of the factors that we held constant when we drew this schedule. That is, suppose now we change household income and make this household richer. Suppose their household income goes from $500 per week to $700 per week. The household is now wealthier. And one of the things that this household might choose to do with its newfound income is purchase more bread. This would be the case if bread is what economists call a normal good. A normal good is a good that a household buys more of when the household income increases. Let's suppose that bread is a normal good for this household. And in that case, we will get a new, higher quantity of bread at every price after income is increased. I'll write these numbers in. And to show that this is a new demand schedule, I'll use the symbol prime or apostrophe by the D to represent that this is a new demand relationship. Prime usually means new. We've got something new, so we're indicating it with this little mark. Well, here's our new demand schedule after the increase in household income. Now, at a price of $5 per loaf, this household wants 2 loaves of bread per week instead of 1. At a price of $3, this household used to want 3 loaves of bread, now they want 4, and so forth, all the way down the schedule. You will see that after an increase in income, this household wants to buy a larger quantity of bread at every price. And that's going to be important language for us as we look at how changes in variables influence the demand curve. So let's take this demand schedule and move it over to the board and draw the new demand curve in the axes that we used to draw the old demand curve. So what I'll do now is move all this stuff over to the board so you'll have it for reference. And I'll go back to the diagram in which we graphed the demand curve. After the increase in income, we'll see that there's a change then in the demand curve. For example, now at a price of $5 per loaf, the households want 2 loaves of bread per week instead of 1. At a price of $4 per loaf, we have a new quantity of 3 loaves demanded per week instead of 2. At a price of $3 per loaf, the quantity demanded after the increase in income is going to be $4 per loaf. Notice, the quantity demanded is larger at every price after income increases. This household now wants 5 loaves of bread when the price of bread is $2.50 per loaf. This household wants 7 loaves of bread when the price is $2.10. At a price of $1.80, the household wants 8 loaves of bread. At a price of $1.50, the household wants 9 loaves of bread. At a price of $1 per loaf, the household wants 10 loaves of bread. And finally, the household wants 12 loaves of bread if the price of bread is down to 50 cents per loaf. Now, are these the only imaginable prices and quantities for this household? Absolutely not. We can imagine price changing continuously. We can imagine quantity demanded changing continuously. And we can connect these dots to get a continuous downward sloping demand curve just like before. Here's the demand curve that represents the relationship between price and quantity demanded after income is increased. Notice that the new demand curve lies further away from the axes. We might use the language that the demand curve has shifted outwards. That is, after the increase in income, since bread is a normal good, the household wants to buy more bread at every price than it was buying before. The outward shift in the demand curve came about because we changed one of the variables that we had previously held constant. When we drew the old demand curve, we allowed price to change to see how the household behavior would change, how quantity would change. But we held income and the price of other goods constant. Whenever we changed income, we get an entirely new relationship between price and quantity. At every price, this wealthier household now wants to buy a larger quantity of bread than they were buying before. The increase in consumer income leads the demand curve to shift outward. It causes an outward shift in the demand curve. That is, the household buys a larger quantity of bread at every price. Now, here's some important language for you to know. Whenever there's a change in the price of bread, the household changes its behavior by moving along the existing demand curve. When a household moves along an existing demand curve, that is, when the household responds to a change in the price of bread, we call this a change in quantity demanded. However, if we change one of the variables that we previously held constant, income, the price of other goods, expectations, this causes us to have to redraw the entire demand curve. It leads to an entirely new relationship between the price of bread and the quantity demanded. We call this shift in the demand curve a change in demand. The entire demand schedule has changed. We have a whole new relationship between price and quantity, and that's what's meant by a shift in the demand curve, or the language, a change in demand. So, a movement along the demand curve is a response to a change in the price of bread itself, and that's called a change in quantity demanded. A shift in the demand curve is caused by a change in one of the variables that we usually hold constant when we draw a demand curve, and this shift is called a change in demand. In the next lesson, we'll do a complete inventory of all the things that can shift the demand curve, and we'll discuss how those various factors that we usually hold constant influence consumer behavior. In this lesson, we're going to do a summary of all of the factors that influence consumer demand, and we're going to show how each of those factors appears in the demand curve diagram. Let's start with the easiest case. How do we show a change in consumer behavior in response to a change in the price of bread itself? This is easy. If the price of bread changes, the consumer moves along the existing demand curve. For instance, if the price of bread goes up, the consumer will be buying less bread than before. We see a decrease in the quantity of bread demanded. If the price of bread, on the other hand, falls, we'll see the consumer buying a larger quantity. Here we have the law of demand at work. The consumer is willing and able to buy more bread when the price is lower, and that's a movement down the demand curve. A lower price for bread corresponds to a larger quantity demanded. Anytime you change the price of bread itself, you are moving along the demand curve. The demand curve never shifts in response to a change in the price of bread. You can never shift a curve when you're changing one of the things that's measured on the axes. You just move along the curve. Suppose now we change another one of the factors that influences consumer demand, one of the factors that we hold constant when we draw the original demand curve. Let's consider first the case of the price of substitute goods. What happens if the price of bagels increases? Well, let's think about the household's decision. With bagels now being less attractive, this household will be more inclined to get their carbohydrates from bread instead. Now, at any given price of bread, the household is going to want to buy more bread than before and fewer bagels. Bagels are relatively unattractive. Bread has become more attractive. So the household wants to buy more bread now at every price. And this shifts the demand curve outward. It changes the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity demanded. And it gives us this entirely new demand curve. With the price of substitutes going up, bread is more attractive and consumers want a larger quantity of bread at every price. Suppose now that the price of bagels falls. If the price of bagels falls, bagels are now relatively attractive. Consumers get more of their carbohydrates from bagels instead, and the quantity of bread demanded at every price shrinks. We represent this change by shifting the demand curve inwards. Now, at every price for bread, consumers demand a smaller quantity of bread than before. The demand curve shifts inwards. We call this a decrease in demand. So, in summary, when the price of substitute goods goes up, there is an increase in demand, a larger quantity demanded at every price. If the price of substitute goods falls, we have a decrease in demand, a smaller quantity demanded at every price. Let's consider another factor that influences consumer behavior, the price of complementary goods. Suppose the price of cheese, a complementary good, falls. In that case, consumers say, well, we like to eat bread with cheese. The price of a cheese sandwich has just decreased. That means we want more cheese sandwiches, and that means buying more bread. When the price of a complement good falls, consumers are going to want more of the original good at every price. Bread is now more attractive, and after the price of the complement falls, households will want to buy more bread at every price than they were buying before. So here's the new demand curve. A decrease in the price of a complement good shifts the demand curve outwards, a larger quantity of bread purchased at every price. If, on the other hand, the price of cheese should increase, the demand curve would shift inwards. Now, with cheese more expensive, consumers say, we don't want cheese sandwiches, we'll eat soup for lunch instead. And if we're not buying cheese for cheese sandwiches, then we're not going to buy the bread to go with it. And that means a smaller quantity of bread purchased at every price, an inward shift of the demand curve. When the price of complementary goods increases, the demand curve shifts inward, a smaller quantity of bread demanded at every price. Here's another thing that can change, consumer income. Now, I've saved this case for later in this lesson because it's relatively subtle. There are two different cases that we want to consider with income. The first is the case of what we call a normal good. A normal good is defined as any good for which the demand increases when income increases. This would be the case with luxury goods like jewelry or vacations. When you get wealthier, when your income increases, you're inclined to want to buy more of these goods at every price. So let's consider first the case of normal goods. With normal goods, when your income increases, you want to buy more of the good at every price. This would be the case for the demand curve for jewelry or vacations. On the other hand, if we have a normal good and your income decreases, you're going to buy less of that good at every price. The demand curve shifts inwards because now, with less purchasing power, you will spend less on those goods than before. So for a normal good, higher income means an increase in demand, and a smaller income means a reduction in demand. The demand curve shifts outwards when income rises and inwards when it falls, if the good is a normal good. Now, the other case with income is what we call the case of inferior goods. Inferior goods are those odd goods for which your demand actually decreases when your income increases. One example of inferior goods that's often given is the case of beans for poor families. Poor families eat beans probably because they can't afford higher protein alternatives like meat. If their income increases, we might see that these families buy less beans and more meat instead. So here's an example of an inferior good. As income increases, the demand for that good actually decreases. A family that gets a higher income is inclined to buy less beans and more meat. So we have the demand curve shifting inward, representing a smaller quantity of beans demanded at every price when the income increases. However, if the good is inferior and your income decreases, then you're inclined to actually buy more of the good. When you get poorer, you're inclined to buy more beans at every price and less meat instead. So with an inferior good, you get exactly the opposite relationship between demand and income that you get with a normal good. With a normal good, higher income shifts the demand curve outwards, lower income shifts it inwards. With an inferior good, higher income shifts the demand curve inwards, and lower income shifts the demand curve outwards. Finally, one more thing we can consider is the expectation of future prices. If you think that the price of bread is going to be rising in the future, then you may go out and buy more bread today, stocking up, making sure your freezer is full before the price increase. A higher expected price in the future leads households to buy more bread today at every price. However, if you think the price of bread is going to go down in the future, you may delay your purchases and wait for a bargain. In that case, your demand curve actually shifts inwards. That is, at any given price for bread, you now want a smaller quantity than before. You're saving up, waiting for the day when the price actually falls. So higher expected prices in the future lead to an increase in demand. Lower expected prices in the future lead to a decrease in current demand. So there you have it, a catalog of things that can shift the demand curve. All of those factors that we hold constant when we draw the demand curve can change. And if they change, we have to redraw the demand curve. We get an entirely new relationship between price and quantity. And we represent that entirely new relationship by a shift in the demand curve. Here's the important language for you to remember. I've said it before, but I'll summarize it because it helps you to be very clear about these important concepts. When you have a change in the variable that's measured on the axis, a change in the price of bread itself, you represent the change in the price of bread as a movement along the demand curve. We talk about a change in the price of bread, a movement along the demand curve, and a change in quantity demanded. They all mean the same thing. If you change one of the factors, on the other hand, that we usually hold constant, we represent that change as a shift in the demand curve. We talk about an increase in income for a normal good, an increase in the price of substitutes, or a decrease in the price of complements, or an increase in expected future prices. We talk about these things leading to an increase in demand. That is, an outward shift in the demand curve. Shifting the curve is the same thing as a change in demand, an increase in the quantity demanded at every price. So all of these phrases that I've used, all of these expressions, are important for you to memorize so that you can use them carefully when you're trying to describe the response of consumers to changes in their environment. In the next lesson, we're going to take this logic that we've developed for a particular household and turn it into a market demand curve by adding up the demand curves of the individual households to get what we call a market demand curve. We've been talking about the demand for bread, and we've been focusing on the behavior of a single household, showing how the relationship between price and quantity demanded varies with changes in income, the prices of substitutes and complements, and other factors. But you may be wondering, what about the overall demand for bread, the demand in the market as a whole? In this lesson, we will show how to take the individual demand curves of households and add them together to get the market demand curve for bread. And it's a simple, straightforward matter. Let's start with our schedule showing how much bread a particular household will demand at different prices. Let's say that we have Bob here, and these numbers represent the quantity of bread that Bob is willing and able to purchase as the price of bread varies. So at $5 a loaf, Bob buys 1 loaf. At $4 a loaf, he buys 2 loaves, and so forth. Suppose now Bob is not the only household in this market. Let's suppose that there is another household, and that's Ann. Ann has a different demand schedule for bread. In fact, Ann buys more bread at every price than Bob does. Perhaps she likes bread better. At $5 a loaf, Ann buys 2 loaves of bread each week. At $4 a loaf, Ann buys 4 loaves, and so forth. So here's Ann's demand schedule for bread, the quantity of bread demanded as a function of the price of bread. Suppose now that Bob and Ann are the only buyers in this market. In order to find the market demand for bread, we need to add together their individual demands. So to find the market demand for bread, take the quantity of bread that Bob demands at each price and add to it the quantity of bread that Ann demands at each price. That will give you the market demand for bread. So at a price of $5, Bob wants 1 loaf of bread per week. Ann wants 2 loaves of bread per week for a total of 3 loaves of bread in the market. If we continue on down the schedule, we will find the overall quantity demanded in the market is the sum of Bob's demand and Ann's demand, the sum of Bob's quantity and Ann's quantity at each price. So at a price of $3 per loaf, Bob wants 3 loaves a week, Ann wants 5, for a market total of 8. Now we've added together Bob's individual demand and Ann's individual demand. At each price, we found the quantity for each of the buyers, add them together, and wind up with the market demand curve. So there you have it. It's simply a matter of addition to go from the individual demand curves to the market demand curve. Let's show now how the same process works in our graph. We'll move all these numbers over to the box where you can use them, and I have here reproduced all of this information in a graph. So I have Bob's information represented in this first diagram. I have Ann's information represented in the middle graph. And over here on the far right, I'm going to sum the two together to get the market demand curve. Let me show you how that works. The process is called horizontal summation because we are adding horizontal distances. Notice in this first diagram, we have Bob's quantity written on the horizontal axis. At each price, the red dot tells us the quantity of bread that Bob is willing and able to purchase at that price. In the second diagram, the horizontal axis measures Ann's quantity, the quantity of bread that Ann is willing and able to purchase at each price. So for instance, suppose we want to know the market demand at a price of $5 per loaf of bread. We take Bob's quantity, which is 1 loaf of bread, and add to that Ann's quantity, which is 2 loaves of bread, to get the market quantity of 3 loaves of bread. We can also do that in a diagram. So, for example here, measure the distance from the axis to the red dot. That's 1 loaf of bread that Bob wants at a price of $5. Add that onto the amount that Ann wants to buy, which is 2 loaves of bread at $5, and we get this horizontal distance. 2 plus 1 is 3. I go over here to $5, and there's a point on my market demand curve. At a price of $5 per loaf, we have a total quantity demanded in this market of 2 loaves from Ann plus 1 loaf from Bob for a total of 3 loaves of bread at a price of $5. I can continue this process if I want. Bob wants 2 loaves at a price of $4, so let's mark that on our ruler. And then go over here and add those 2 loaves to the 4 loaves that Ann wants at a price of $4. So we have 2 loaves plus 4 loaves is a total of 6 loaves, and go over here and put those 6 loaves as a dot in the market demand curve. So if Bob wants 2 loaves at $4 and Ann wants 4 loaves, 2 plus 4 is a total of 6. Add them together, and you get another point on the market demand curve. I could keep doing this horizontal sum. At each price, find the quantity that Bob wants, add it to the quantity that Ann wants to get the market quantity. I could keep doing this exercise, going and adding Bob's distance onto Ann's distance to get the total. But you know that we already have the market sum from over in the box, so I can go ahead and just plot the numbers. I've already done the addition. 3 was the quantity demanded in the market at a price of $5. 6 is the quantity demanded in the market at a price of $4. At a price of $3, I have a total of 8 loaves of bread demanded. At a price of $2.50, my total quantity demanded is 10. At a price of $1 or $2.10 a loaf, I have a total quantity demanded of 12. And at a price of $1.80 per loaf, my total quantity demanded is 14. These are all the points on the market demand curve. Now, just as we can connect the dots to get the individual demand curves, we can connect the dots to get the market demand curve. If I go over and connect these dots, I get the individual demand curve for Bob. If I go next door to this diagram and connect these dots, I get the individual demand curve for Ann. And if I connect the dots in the far diagram, that is the sum of these two individual demand curves, I get the market demand curve. And I'll simply label it with a D because it represents the sum of Bob and Ann and anyone else if we did this exercise more generally. So the idea here is this. If you take Bob's demand curve and add it to Ann's demand curve, you get the total demand in the market. That is, for any price that we choose on the vertical axis, go over to Bob's demand curve to get the horizontal distance, the quantity that Bob demands, and add that to the horizontal distance at the same price over in Ann's demand curve. And that horizontal distance, the sum of Bob's plus Ann's quantity demanded, will show up over here in the market demand curve at the same price. So, one more example. At a price of $2.10 per loaf, Bob wants 5 loaves of bread each week, and Ann wants 7 loaves of bread each week. 5 plus 7 gives us a total market demand of 12 loaves of bread at a price of $2.10. Since the market demand curve is just the sum of the individual demand curves, anything that shifts the individual demand curves will also shift the market demand curve. That is, if household income changes, if the price of substitutes or complements change, if tastes and preference change, if expectations change. Anything that shifts Bob's individual demand curve or Ann's individual demand curve will shift the market demand curve. For instance, suppose we're talking once again about the market for bread, and suppose that bread is a normal good. If Bob's income increases, Bob's demand curve for bread will shift outward. And when it shifts outwards, horizontal summation will lead to a market demand curve that's further away from the axes. Anything that shifts out Bob's curve or Ann's curve will also shift out the market demand curve, since it is the sum of the individual demand curves. Now that we've described the consumer side of the market, we'll look now at the producer side of the market. We'll look at the logic of the seller. As the sellers pursue their profits and try to maximize the money that they make from their businesses, their behavior will be summarized in a supply curve, and that's where we'll go next. In the last lectures, we've been considering the consumer side of the economy, those factors that influence the demand for particular goods and services. Now we'll shift our attention to the supply side of the economy. We'll look at the determinants of the supply of a particular good or service. Let's think now about the agents we're studying, people who offer bread for sale. These are people like bakers and other stores that are trying to make a profit by selling bread. Profit is the difference between the revenue that a company earns and its costs of providing its good or service. So any factors that influence profit, that is, any factors that influence revenue or costs, are going to have an effect on the supply decisions of firms. Let's look then at some of those factors, because they turn out to be the determinants of supply. Think about the market for bread. What are the determinants then of the profitability of a company that might want to sell bread? What are the factors that are going to influence how much bread they are profitably able to offer for sale? Well, one important component of their decision will be the price at which they can offer bread for sale. If the price of bread is high, the prospects for profits are good, and it's more likely that there will be lots of companies offering lots of bread for sale. If prices of bread are low, on the other hand, it's unlikely that a lot of bakers will be able to make a profit, and the quantity of bread offered for sale will be lower. Well, that works on the revenue side of things. What about on the cost side of things? One important factor will be the cost of inputs, like bread, or like milk and eggs, things that are used to make bread. So the input prices are important. The higher the input prices, the higher the company's costs, and the less profitable it will be for companies to offer bread for sale. When input prices are lower, it's going to be more likely that a company can make a profit selling bread, and the amount of bread offered for sale is likely to be higher. However, input prices are just one part of the cost side of a firm. Another side of this equation is going to be technology. How is this firm going to be able to combine inputs to produce bread? If you have good technology, you can get by with very little milk and eggs to make your bread. If you have bad technology or are wasteful or unproductive, you're going to have to buy a lot more inputs, and that raises your costs of production. So technology is important. The better technology is for producing bread, the lower the costs of the company, and the more likely it is that that company will offer lots of bread for sale. If technology is not as good, costs will be higher, and the bread supplied will probably be a smaller quantity. One more thing that influences the supply decision will be expectations. Just like in the case of households, producers are looking forward to the future, trying to figure out whether the prices of bread will go up or down, what will happen to the prices of their inputs. And as they change their expectations, they may be changing the timing of production. If they think bread prices are going to rise next week, they may save bread on their shelves this week and try to sell it later. They may freeze bread in anticipation of being able to charge a higher price in the future. So we have then 4 factors that influence the supply decision of firms: the price of bread, the price of inputs, technology for production, and expectations of future prices. Now, of course, I'm going to want to turn these into a supply function. So I need mathematical symbols for all of these ideas. We'll let the quantity of bread supplied be represented by Q sub S, and I'm using the color blue here because blue will be my official color for supply. The price of bread will represent, as before, with a P. The price of inputs with P sub I. The technology of the firm will represent with the letter T, and the expectations of future prices with the letter EX. Now, we're ready to write down a supply function. A supply function shows the amount of bread that a firm is willing and able to supply profitably as a function of all of the variables that influence its decision: the price of bread, the price of milk and eggs, the technology of production, and the expectation of future prices. So let me take my icons off the pad, and I'll turn these symbols into a function. We want to now describe the quantity of bread supplied as a function, and I'm going to use for my function the letter S, my blue S, to be supply. So I'm going to have a function called a supply function, and the quantity of bread supplied depends on all of these variables: the price that we can charge for a loaf of bread, the price that we have to pay for milk and eggs and other inputs, the technology, that is how effectively we can turn inputs into output, and finally the expectation of future prices. There you have it, the supply function for a particular firm. If you know the value of prices, input prices, the state of technology, and the expectations for the future, you'll be able to say how much bread a particular firm will offer for sale. And there you have it, the quantity of bread supplied expressed as a function of all of the variables that influence the supplier's behavior. Now what we'll do is look at a supply schedule, the behavior of a particular firm in response to different possible prices for a loaf of bread. Then we'll take the supply schedule and turn it into a supply curve. In the last lecture, we made a list of those factors that influence the behavior of suppliers. In this lecture, we're going to look at a particular factor, that is, the price of bread, and how the behavior of suppliers is related to the price that they can charge for the product. Remember that we said that the quantity of bread that was supplied was influenced by the price of bread, the technology of production, the price of inputs, and the producer's expectations about future prices. What we'll do now is look at the relationship between the quantity of bread supplied and the price of bread, holding constant all of these other factors. Once again, we'll be invoking the assumption ceteris paribus to look at how the quantity of bread supplied in the market is influenced by changes in the market price of bread, holding constant expectations, technology, and the price of inputs. This will give us a supply schedule, and we'll begin by looking at the supply schedule for an individual firm. Suppose we have a baker whose behavior can be summarized in this table. That is, the quantity of bread that our baker supplies is related to the price of bread. When I draw this supply schedule, I am invoking ceteris paribus. I'm holding constant everything else that this baker cares about: technology, input prices, expectations about the future. I'm looking only at how his behavior would change in response to a change in the market price of bread. So, for instance, our particular baker here will supply one loaf of bread per week. That is, he is willing and able to offer one loaf of bread for sale each week when the price of bread is 40 cents per loaf. If the price of bread goes up to 60 cents per loaf, he is willing and able to offer 2 loaves of bread for sale a week, and so forth. At a price of $1, the quantity supplied is 3 loaves of bread. At a price of $1.50, the quantity supplied is 4 loaves, and so forth, all the way to the end of our chart. Again, this supply schedule represents a relationship between the market price of bread and the quantity of bread that our seller is willing and able to offer, holding constant all of the other factors that influence the supplier's behavior. The next step in this analysis is to take the information from this supply schedule and convert it into a supply curve. That is, a graph that represents the relationship between price and quantity supplied for our particular baker. So that's where we'll go next. I'll move this information over onto the board, and I'll put up axes here that I can use to graph the relationship between price and quantity for this baker. So on the horizontal axis, we will be measuring the quantity of bread that is supplied, that is, how much bread our seller is willing and able to offer for sale. And on the vertical axis, we will represent the price of bread, which again will be measured in dollars. Now, I'm going to take the information from the table and represent it in the graph. So at a price of 40 cents per loaf, we get a quantity of bread supplied of 1 loaf per week. So here's a blue dot that represents that combination, 40 cents from the vertical axis and 1 loaf of bread from the horizontal axis. We get 2 loaves of bread when the price goes up to 60 cents per week. So let me go on into my diagram. 2 loaves of bread at a price of 60 cents gives me a point like this one. I get 3 loaves when the price is up to $1. And this particular baker will offer 4 loaves for sale if the price of bread rises to $1.50. We get another loaf of bread at a price of $2.10 per week. So let me put that point on the diagram. And we get 6 loaves of bread when the price is all the way up to $2.50 per week. In each case, I'm measuring price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. I get 7 loaves of bread at a price of $3 per week, or $3 per loaf, 7 loaves of bread per week. At a price of $4 per loaf, this particular baker is willing to offer 8 loaves of bread for sale each week. So that gives me this point. And at a price of $5, this baker offers 9 loaves of bread for sale each week. So that gives me this point. Now, are these the only imaginable quantities of bread? No, you can imagine fractional quantities. The baker could offer 2 loaves for sale over the course of 3 weeks, which would average out to be 2/3 of a loaf a week. Or he could offer 3 loaves for sale every 2 weeks, which would average out to be 1.5 loaves per week. So it's possible that there would be fractional loaves of bread sold. He could even bake a half a loaf if he was so inclined. And it's also possible to imagine prices varying continually from 0 all the way up to $6, $7, $10. So the continuous variation of prices and the continuous divisibility of quantities of bread allows us to connect these dots and make a smooth supply curve representing this baker's behavior. So let me connect the dots. And when I connect the dots, I have created a supply curve. The supply curve is a collection of points representing the quantity of bread that a baker is willing and able to offer for sale in a given period of time as a function of the price of bread per loaf. So it's a relationship between price and quantity supplied for this particular baker. I'm going to label this curve with an S to indicate that it's the supply curve. Now, there is something you need to notice immediately about the supply curve, and that is that the supply curve slopes upwards. This is a representation of what economists call the law of supply. The law of supply is a regularity that we notice in the economy. That is, as the price of a good or service increases, the quantity that is offered for sale generally increases. Now, does this make sense? What's the intuition behind the law of supply? The intuition behind the law of supply is a concept that we've already considered in this series, and that's the concept of increasing opportunity cost. That is, the more bread a particular baker offers for sale, the higher the cost of each additional loaf. The cost of each additional loaf tends to rise. Here's an example that might make that clearer. Think about what the baker puts into this operation. Every time this baker bakes a loaf of bread, that's taking extra time and extra resources. To bake 1 loaf of bread might take time away from watching television, time that's not especially valuable. His opportunity cost for that hour is small. But if he spends more and more time in the kitchen baking bread, eventually he's taking time away from fishing. He's taking time away from spending with his family. He's taking time away from pleasurable leisure activities like reading. He may also be taking time away from other opportunities to make money. And the more bread that he produces, the more he is having to go to hours of time that are more and more valuable to him. Giving up his TV time is no big deal. Giving up his fishing time is a little more serious. Giving up his family time is more serious still. So we have to pay him larger and larger amounts of money to get him to produce larger and larger quantities of bread. Getting him to produce a small quantity of bread doesn't take much of his time, so he's willing to do that for a small amount of money. But getting him to produce a large quantity of bread begins to take away from time that's more valuable. His opportunity cost of producing additional loaves of bread continually rises as we eat into more and more valuable time, as we take him away from more and more pleasurable activities. That's why it takes higher and higher prices to get this baker to make more and more bread. The supply curve is upward sloping because of increasing opportunity costs. We'll see later in this series how the upward sloping supply curve is related to increasing marginal costs associated with diminishing productivity of resources. But for now, a good answer to the question, why does the supply curve slope upwards, is this. The supply curve slopes upwards because the opportunity costs of production rise as the baker makes more and more bread. In the next lesson, we'll look at those factors that shift the supply curve. That is, what if we allow those things to vary that we previously held constant? What if we relax the assumption of ceteris paribus and allow the price of inputs to change or technology to improve? How would that influence the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity that our baker is willing and able to offer for sale? The supply curve shows the relationship between the price of bread and the quantity of bread that a seller is willing and able to offer for sale, holding constant other factors that influence supply, such as the price of inputs, technology, and expectations about future prices. What happens to the supply curve if we change some of those other variables? Of course, the supply curve shifts. In this lesson, we'll be looking at a particular case of a shift in the supply curve. Then, in the next lesson, we'll be looking at a catalog of all of the factors that can shift the supply curve. So let's start with a specific example. Remember, we're talking about a particular baker who has this relationship between price and quantity. This is the supply schedule that we used in the last lesson. Suppose now that we allow a change in one of the factors that we held constant when we wrote down this schedule. Suppose, in particular, that we allow the price of inputs to increase. An increase in the price of milk and eggs and other inputs used to produce bread is going to influence the profitability of this bakery. In particular, with higher input prices, it's going to be less profitable to make bread, and the response of the baker will be to scale back his operation. With the higher prices for inputs, we will see a smaller quantity of bread supplied at every price. So we can put these numbers in the table to represent the quantity supplied after the change in input prices. And as before, I'm putting a little apostrophe after the S, a symbol we usually call prime, to indicate S prime is a new supply schedule after the change in input prices. So with the higher prices of inputs, this baker is unwilling to offer any bread for sale at a price of 40 cents per loaf. We get the first loaf of bread on sale at a price of 60 cents per loaf, 2 loaves offered at $1 per loaf, 3 loaves at $1.50 per loaf, 3.5 loaves per week sold at a price of $2.10 per loaf, and so forth. Notice that we have a smaller quantity supplied than before at every price. A change in one of the variables that we previously held constant required us to redraw the entire supply schedule. Now, I'll move this information over to the board and will represent this change in supply as a shift in the supply curve that we drew. Here I go, moving the information to the board. And I will go back to the diagram that we were looking at before. With a change in input prices, with an increase in the price of milk and eggs and other factors that go into producing bread, we're going to get a change in the supplier's behavior. Let me simply graph the numbers from the table over on the board. At a price of 40 cents now, we have 0 loaves of bread offered for sale. So the new dot for the new supply curve will be over at a quantity of 0 at a price of 40 cents. So it shifts over to the axis itself. At a price of 60 cents per loaf, we now get 1 loaf of bread offered for sale per week. So here's a point on the new supply curve at 60 cents per loaf and 1 loaf per week. At a price of $1 per loaf now, we get 2 loaves of bread for sale. So here's another point on the new supply curve. The price is $1 and the quantity that the baker is willing and able to sell is 2 loaves. Another point is 3 loaves offered for sale at a price of $1.50 per loaf. So here's a point on the new supply curve. We get 3.5 loaves offered for sale at a price of $2.10 per loaf. So here's another point. Price $2.10, quantity 3.5 loaves. We get 4 loaves for this particular baker when the price is up to $2.50 per week. So that's going to be this point, 4 loaves, $2.50. We get 5 loaves at a price of $3 per loaf. That's going to be this point in the diagram. And 6 loaves at a price of $4 per loaf. That will be this point in the diagram. And finally, we get 6½ loaves at a price of $5 per loaf. So that's going to be this point up here on the diagram. $5 on the vertical axis and 6½ loaves on the horizontal axis. I'm trying to be careful here, make sure that my numbers line up, 5 and 6½. Now I can connect these dots because all the prices and quantities in between are imaginable, and I'll label my new curve S prime. It's a new relationship between price and quantity for this baker after the price of inputs increases. So the supply curve has shifted inwards. The increase in the price of inputs made bread a less profitable business and resulted in our supplier offering a smaller quantity of bread for sale at every price. Now, let's go back and review something that we talked about when we introduced the concept of shifts back in our study of the demand curve. If the price of bread changes, you move along your given supply curve. A change in the price of bread leads to a change in the quantity of bread supplied, and that's represented as a movement along a given supply curve. But if you change one of those variables that we hold constant when we draw the supply curve, then you have to shift the supply curve. The entire relationship between price and quantity changes for that baker because input prices have increased. We call this change in one of those variables, and the shift in the supply curve, a change in supply. A change in quantity supplied is a response to the price of bread changing, and that's a movement along the supply curve. But if you change one of those other factors, like the price of inputs, technology, and so forth, then you have to redraw the entire supply curve, and we call that a change in supply. In the next lesson, we'll go through an entire catalog of factors that can shift the supply curve. We will look at all of those things that can cause a change in supply. And I'll give you a chance to make some predictions about which way you think the supply curve will move in each case.